The city glittered under the velvet canopy of twilight, lights blinking like stars trapped in concrete. Manhattan never slept, but tonight it felt especially alive. The wind carried with it the scent of luxury freshly polished leather from limousines, the faint perfume of magnolias from high-rise balconies, and the sharp clink of glasses in rooftop lounges. Among the many glittering gatherings across the city that night, one stood out in its exclusivity. A private dinner hosted by Miles Davenport, a fashion industry magnate known for his extravagant soirees and ruthless business acumen. Emma Carlyle sat at her vanity, staring into her reflection with a practiced calm. Her eyes, outlined in sharp smoky hues, held the kind of focus that made junior designers tremble and boardroom executives stammer. She wasn't dressing for a dinner. She was dressing for war, though no one else would see it that way. The black silk gown she chose wrapped around her like armor, cinched at the waist and plunging just enough to command attention without seeming desperate. Her earrings, sapphire studs, were a subtle nod to elegance, and her heels, impossibly high, made her tower like a queen surveying her domain. She ran a brush through her sleek brunette hair one last time before setting it down. Her phone vibrated beside her. A message flashed on the screen. Claire Rousseau. Looking forward to seeing you tonight. Emma stared at the message for a moment longer than she needed to. The emoji at the end felt more like a threat than a friendly gesture. She locked her phone without replying, inhaled deeply, and rose from her seat. Tonight, there would be no retreat. Not after everything Claire had done. Claire, for her part, was already en route. Her chauffeur, Vincent, navigated through Fifth Avenue's traffic with the precision of a seasoned driver. Claire leaned back in the plush leather seat of her Maybach, legs crossed, a glass of chilled Prosecco in one hand. She looked like someone born to rule, blonde waves perfectly arranged in a side-swept style, eyes hidden behind oversized Gucci sunglasses, and a dress of deep emerald silk hugging her figure with sensual grace. But beneath her polished exterior, her thoughts ran erratic. What would Emma wear? Would she bring up the merger? Or worse, the Paris incident? Claire shook her head slightly, as though dismissing the thought. The past was the past. They were grown women now, powerful and poised. There was no reason for drama unless Emma invited it. The dinner was held at a private gallery space converted just for the occasion. Miles had spared no expense. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, reflecting of the marble floors like 1,000 tiny suns. White orchids floated in tall glass vases on every table, and a string quartet played soft Mozart in the background. The guest list read like the who's who of the fashion world. Editors from Vogue and Elle, celebrity stylists, designers, influencers, with millions of followers and investors who practically owned half the couture world. Each guest was dressed to kill, but none entered with as much whispered anticipation as Emma Carlyle and Claire Rousseau. Emma arrived first. She was greeted by Miles himself, who offered a kiss on both cheeks and a compliment that danced on the edge of flattery. "You're as breathtaking as ever," he said, offering his arm. The night just became more interesting. Emma smiled tightly. "Let's hope it stays interesting and not dramatic," Miles laughed. "You and Claire still at it? I always thought you two made a terrifyingly perfect team." "We did," Emma replied. "Until we didn't." She was soon pulled into a circle of executives and editors, each eager for a moment of her attention. She moved like smoke, calm, smooth, and impossible to grasp. Claire arrived 20 minutes later, fashionably late as always. Her entrance was calculated. She stepped in alone, walked directly to the center of the room, and greeted Miles with a kiss so close to his lips it made photographers shift for a better angle. Her laugh was soft but deliberate. Everyone noticed, including Emma. The two women finally locked eyes across the room, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. Neither smiled, neither flinched. It was a stare that held years of history, once full of laughter, now hollowed out by betrayal. They hadn't spoken face to face in over 8 months. IT had all begun to unravel during the Milan showcase. Their joint label, Carlyle and Rousseau, had been the darling of the European runways. Investors were eager, orders were piling in, and the media had dubbed them the twin tycoons. But ambition has a way of souring friendship. Claire had taken a secret meeting with a rival brand, behind Emma's back, an acquisition pitch that would have left Emma out entirely. Emma found out days later through an anonymous email with screenshots attached. The fallout was nuclear. Emma withdrew all joint shares, legally dissolved the brand, and cut off all communication. Claire, humiliated, tried to justify it as a strategic exploration, but Emma saw it as the deepest betrayal. Now, months later, here they were both still standing, both still relevant, and both boiling beneath icy smiles as the dinner began. Assigned seating forced them to sit across from one another at the long candlelit table. Miles sat between them, perhaps foolishly assuming he could diffuse any lingering tension. To his left sat Emma, and to his right, Claire. The appetizers were served caviar on smoked salmon crostini, and polite conversation flowed. Guests laughed, clinked glasses, and exchanged industry gossip. But under the table, Claire's foot tapped with irritation, and Emma's hand tightened around her fork more than once. "So, Emma," Claire began, her voice honeyed, "I saw your latest collaboration with Ferrara. Gorgeous campaign, though it felt familiar." Emma didn't take the bait immediately. She dabbed her mouth with a napkin and looked at Claire coolly. "Thank you. I've always believed originality comes from integrity. Some of us still operate by that standard." A few heads turned. A couple of guests raised their brows. Their hair shifted. Claire smiled, but her eyes narrowed. "Oh, I couldn't agree more. Though, I do believe strategy has its own form of integrity. You of all people should appreciate that." Miles chuckled nervously. Now, ladies, let's keep it civil. We wouldn't want a fashion war to break out before dessert. Too late for that," Emma said under her breath. The main course arrived, rack of lamb with truffle risotto. Conversation at the table veered elsewhere, but the tension between the women remained like an electric current beneath the silverware. Claire leaned slightly forward. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly, only loud enough for Emma to hear. Emma looked up. "Regret what?" "Walking away. We built something extraordinary, and you torched it." Emma's voice dropped an octave. "No, I regret trusting someone who looked me in the eye and lied." Claire's expression faltered for just a second, just long enough for Emma to catch it. "You were always the favorite," Claire said suddenly. "Everyone fawned over you. I did all the groundwork, and you got the glory. That's what you never understood. I didn't ask to be worshipped." Emma shot back, her tone colder now. "I worked just as hard, harder, in fact. But maybe if you weren't so obsessed with credit, you wouldn't have had to stab me in the back to get it." Claire opened her mouth, but a sudden toast interrupted her. Miles stood, raising his glass to power, to beauty, and to partnerships past, present, and future. The irony wasn't lost on anyone at the table. Glasses clinked, but the unease remained. Emma and Claire raised their glasses too, never breaking eye contact. The wine was bitter on both tongues. As dessert approached, chocolate mousse with gold leaf and raspberry coulis. Guests were whispering more than talking. Some had begun to notice the unspoken battle between the two women. Others pretended not to see it, and still, neither Emma nor Claire backed down. By the end of the night, they had exchanged more than pleasantries, daggers disguised as compliments. History wrapped in hostility. The clash hadn't fully erupted yet, but the stage was set. The next time they met, there would be no holding back. The fuse had been lit. The room glittered with elegance, but the air felt taut, like a thread stretched afar. Conversation hummed around the grand dining table. Laughs mingled with the chime of crystal glasses and silverware scraping porcelain. But under the velvet atmosphere of luxury, something raw and volatile pulsed beneath the surface. Claire Rousseau shifted in her seat. Her smile, dazzling under the low candlelight, never wavered, but a bead of sweat slipped down her spine despite the climate-controlled room. She could feel Emma Carlyle's gaze across the table, cool, analytical, and laced with years of disappointment. Emma didn't need to say a word. Claire could hear the judgment in her silence. Emma, on the other hand, kept her expression unreadable. She had mastered that art long ago, masking emotion behind a veneer of calm. In the fashion industry, it was as crucial as knowing color theory or managing a team. But inside, she churned. The faint taste of bitterness clung to her tongue, and not from the Pinot Noir swirling in her glass. No, it was the memory of betrayal, the late-night phone call from her assistant, the forwarded emails, the attachment she opened only to see Claire's signature beside a competitor's logo. No explanation, no warning, just treason wrapped in business speak. And now, here they were, playing their parts at the theatre of Miles Davenport's high society dinner. Photographers had been banned from the inside, but that didn't matter. In this room, secrets spread faster than headlines. "Tell me," drawled Vivian Latimer, the editor-in-chief of Modern Vogue, from across the table, "are you two ever going to collaborate again? Or should the fashion world mourn the death of the golden era?" Her tone was teasing, but the question hit hard. Emma gave a diplomatic smile. "I think we've both grown into our own creative visions. Sometimes separation brings clarity." Claire's fork paused above her risotto for the briefest second. "Oh, I'm sure it does. But some things are simply stronger together. Don't you think, Emma?" Emma tilted her head, a spark flaring in her eyes. "Only if both parts are loyal to the whole." A few guests coughed or sipped their wine quickly, pretending not to hear the barb. But everyone heard. Even the violinist in the corner seemed to play softer now, as though the music itself didn't want to interfere. The tension was no longer an undercurrent. It was a rising tide, seeping through the white linens and gilded tableware. Miles, trying to salvage the evening, leaned into charm. "Let's not forget, ladies, that empires have been built on conflict. Perhaps this is simply the prologue to your next collaboration." Claire chuckled lightly. "Or the sequel to a tragedy." Emma didn't respond, choosing instead to delicately slice through her lamb with precise strokes. But her silence was its own rebuttal. The wine flowed freely. Bottles of 2010 Stomargo were passed around like peace offerings, but the war at the table had already begun. The rest of the guests, the influencers, stylists, and editors felt it in their bones. This wasn't just a personal feud. It was a rupture of something bigger. Emma and Claire had been icon symbols of feminine power, unity, and artistic brilliance. Their brand had redefined modern couture with bold lines, subversive textures, and a gender-fluid aesthetic that had won global acclaim. They weren't just collaborators. They had been muses for one another, sisters in ambition. But ambition, like fire, could either illuminate or consume. As the empty plates were cleared, dessert menus circulated. The host staff glided silently through the room, clearing, refilling, adjusting. Emma excused herself to the powder room. Claire watched her go with narrowed eyes. Inside the marbled bathroom, Emma stood before the mirror, gripping the edge of the sink. Her breath forked slightly on the glass as she stared at her reflection. Her lipstick was still perfect, her eyeliner sharp, but beneath the armor, she felt something ancient, a mix of rage and sorrow, coiling around her ribs like a corset. She remembered the first time she met Claire. They'd both been interns at Vesta Couture, 22 and starving for recognition. They bonded over their disdain for their bosses and dreams of something bigger. They used to design together in Emma's cramped apartment, pinning fabric samples to the walls, scribbling sketches until dawn. Their laughter echoed through sleepless nights and espresso-fueled mornings. And then, money came. Fame followed. The purity of creation became muddied with deals, press releases, and NDAs. Still, Emma had held on until Claire's betrayal shattered everything. When Emma returned to the table, Claire was deep in conversation with Lucien Gray, a notoriously flirtatious investor with stakes in half the labels in Europe. He leaned toward Claire, his hand barely brushing hers on the table. Emma took her seat, her expression unreadable once again, though her eyes briefly flicked to their hands. Lucien was just telling me, Claire said, as if Emma had interrupted something, that he's been looking for new talent. Something fresh, maybe even something with Parisian flair. Emma offered a polite nod. Lucien's definition of fresh hasn't changed in 20 years. A few guests stifled laughs. Lucien flushed, chuckled awkwardly, and took a large gulp of wine. Claire's smile tightened. You always did know how to own a room, Claire murmured, a note of resentment under the praise, and you always knew how to read it wrong. Emma replied. The gloves were off. I suppose we should talk about it, Claire said, loud enough now for others too. Listen, if only to stop everyone from whispering behind their napkins. Emma sipped her wine. I didn't realize your conscience was so bothered. Oh, it's not conscience, Claire said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. It's reputation. Unlike you, I care about perception. That stirred more than Emma let on. She had taken the fall when they split. Claire's publicist had spun the narrative expertly, painting Claire as the level-headed visionary and Emma as the unstable creative genius who burned bridges. The press bought it. So did the investors. Emma leaned forward slightly, voice low and even. Then maybe you should thought about perception before you signed with Verlano behind my back. Claire's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. That was business. No, Emma said. That was betrayal. And the only reason you're still relevant is because you used what we built to launch yourself higher. Gasps, soft and involuntary, rippled down the table. The dinner party had become theatre. Claire's cheeks flushed. You're jealous, she said. That I moved on. That I didn't cling to the ashes. Emma laughed, once quiet, cold. You call this moving on? You're in the same room, chasing the same investors, still trying to prove something to me, because you turned everyone against me. You turned on yourself the moment you put greed before partnership. They were no longer whispering. Guests were frozen, forks suspended midair, wine forgotten in glasses. Miles raised a hand. Ladies, this really isn't. But neither woman heard him. Claire stood, the motion sudden, her voice trembling with fury. You don't get to rewrite history, Emma. You were impossible, controlling. You treated me like your assistant. Emma stood too. And you played the victim every time things didn't go your way. You wanted credit without responsibility, because you made all the decisions. Because I had the vision. You just wanted the spotlight. Silence fell. Like a dropped curtain. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely. Claire's voice cracked. You were supposed to be my friend. Emma's face softened for just a moment, but only a moment. And you were supposed to be mine. No one knew what to say. No one dared move. Claire turned abruptly, leaving her half-finished mousse and disappearing into the hallway. A moment later, the sound of high heels on marble echoed away from the room. Emma stood still, chest rising and falling. Her hands trembled at her sides. Miles finally spoke, his voice measured but strained. Perhaps. Coffee on the terrace. The guests rose hesitantly, murmuring among themselves, as if emerging from a spell. Emma remained behind, Alone at the table, she lowered herself back into her chair and stared at Claire's empty seat. So many years, so much brilliance, now reduced to scorched memories and public wounds. Outside the window, the city sparkled as if unaware of the storm that had just passed through one of its most glamorous rooms. The terrace air was heavy with murmurs and misplaced laughter. Waiters moved silently among guests, offering steaming espresso in delicate porcelain cups and crystal tumblers of vintage cognac. The moon, now high in the sky, cast a pale light over the rooftop garden that wrapped around the gallery's upper floor. City lights sparkled beneath like a sea of glittering secrets, and yet no one was looking at the skyline. All eyes furtive and cautious kept drifting toward the doors Claire had stormed through and the quiet corner where Emma now stood alone. Emma rested both hands on the stone balustrade, gazing out across Manhattan. She looked calm, regal, even. Her dress fluttered in the soft breeze, and her profile was a painting elegant and composed. But inside, she was unraveling. Her stomach churned, her thoughts spiraled, and her fingertips tingled with unspent fury. It wasn't just about Claire not anymore. It was everything. The betrayal, the headlines, the whispers in every hallway she entered, the friends who drifted to Claire's orbit like moths to a flame. She had carried that silence like a crown, never retaliating, never correcting the narrative. Until tonight. Now it was all out in the open, behind her. The guests tried to resume casual conversation. Vivian Latimer sipped her cognac with an amused smirk, gossip already forming on her tongue. Lucian Gray stood awkwardly near the marble fire pit, likely contemplating which of the two women could still serve him better. Miles Davenport paced slowly by the hydrangea hedges, deeply regretting the ambitious idea of seating Claire and Emma across from each other. And then, the terrace. Doors opened again. Claire returned. Gone was the smirk, the social armor. Her cheeks were flushed not just from wine or humiliation, but from the fire within her that had been stoked many times in silence. Her heels clicked against the stone tiles with purpose. In her hand, a glass of bourbon sloshed slightly, nearly empty. She had been somewhere private, somewhere quiet enough to let the tears fall, but not long enough to forget why they had fallen. Emma turned slowly, her eyes catching Claire's instantly. Another charged silence passed between them, and the crowd, as though connected to their breath, hushed once more. Claire walked right up to her, stopping just a few feet away. The breeze caught her hair and the folds of her dress, but her voice cut clean through the night. "I should have said it a long time ago," Claire began, "but I was too proud. Or maybe too afraid." Emma blinked, but said nothing. Claire glanced at the circle of onlookers behind them. She took a shaky breath and looked back at Emma. "You were right. I did betray you. I told myself it was a business move, that it wasn't personal, but it was. It always was." Emma felt her jaw tighten. She didn't want an apology. Not here. Not now. But Claire wasn't done. "You got everything first," Claire continued, her voice gaining strength. "The clients, the press, the admiration. And I told myself it was luck or favoritism. But the truth, you worked harder. You were better. I just didn't want to be left behind." Emma's heart thudded in her chest. She didn't know how to respond. For years, she had imagined what Claire would say if she ever owned up to what happened. But now, standing there beneath the stars, hearing the words spoken aloud, she didn't feel vindicated, she felt exposed. "You hurt me," Emma finally said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "You didn't just go behind my back, Claire. You erased me from what we built. Like I was just a phase you outgrew." Claire's eyes welled. "I know, and I thought if I could just make my own mark, if I could succeed without you, it would justify everything. But I was wrong. All I did was hollow myself out." The guests didn't pretend to ignore them anymore. They listened, carefully. Journalists, stylists, investors, they all stood still, suspended in the drama of two titans bearing their wounds. Emma folded her arms, not as a defense, but as a brace. "You made me out to be the villain. Your PR team fed lies to the media. I stayed silent to protect our legacy. And you twisted it." Claire looked down. "I know. And I hate myself for that." A long pause followed. Emma shook her head slightly, as if trying to find footing in an emotional terrain she hadn't prepared for. "So what now? You clear your conscience, and we all go back to sipping champagne like nothing happened?" "No," Claire said quietly. "I just wanted you to know that the truth lives, even if it took too long to come out. I know I can't fix it, but I needed to say it." Emma stared at her for a long time, then looked at the guests still gathered behind them. "Do you want the truth?" Emma said, her voice louder now, addressing the crowd. "Here it is. Claire and I built a brand that changed the industry. We were unstoppable, until ego got in the way, mine and hers. We stopped seeing each other as partners and started seeing each other as obstacles." Claire stiffened but didn't interrupt. "I'm not innocent in this," Emma continued. "I took control because I was afraid that letting her shine meant dimming my own light. I micromanaged, I pushed, and I didn't listen when she asked for space. The air thickened. Some guests looked stunned. Others exchanged knowing glances. Miles froze, not daring to interrupt what had become a confession, but betrayal doesn't get a pass just because the path was hard, Emma added, turning back to Claire. You didn't just go after a deal. You broke trust. You burned the bridge, then stood on the ashes and blamed the wind. Claire's shoulders dropped. I've hated you, Emma said, but I've missed you more. Claire's eyes welled again. I miss you too. Every single day. The honesty between them was disarming. Vulnerability bled into every word. And suddenly, this dinner meant to be a celebration of power had become a cathartic reckoning. Emma took a step closer. We can't go back, Claire, I know. But maybe we don't have to keep going forward as enemies. Claire managed a soft smile. Then what are we? Emma considered for a long moment. Maybe just survivors. They both laughed quiet, breathless, and real. It was the first honest laugh they had shared in over a year. Vivian Latimer clapped softly, prompting others to follow, not as a performance, but as recognition. The moment was raw, unfiltered. In a world of curated feeds and controlled narratives, this was the kind of truth people rarely witnessed. Miles stepped forward, raising his glass to Emma and Claire, for proving that even in fashion, where everything is tailored and stitched, the human heart is still the most fragile fabric of all. Glasses clinked. Champagne bubbled. The string quartet resumed a gentle tune. Emma and Claire stood side by side, not as friends yet, not as enemies anymore, but as two women who had finally spoken their truth. Later that night, as the terrace began to empty and the city sank into its quieter hours, Emma sat alone again on the stone bench overlooking the skyline. Claire approached, barefoot now, heels in hand. Do you remember the night we stayed up until AM sewing that sample dress for Paris? Claire asked, sitting beside her. Emma smiled faintly. You stabbed yourself with the needle 5 times. Claire grinned. And you threatened to light the whole thing on fire if the hem didn't hold. I meant it too. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Claire eventually said, would you ever want to try again? Not a business, just friendship? Emma looked at her for a long time. I don't know, she said honestly. But maybe, Claire nodded. Maybe is more than I deserve. Maybe, Emma replied, is the first stitch. They didn't hug. They didn't pose for photos. But they sat together until the candles burned out and the city whispered its lullaby. 2 weeks had passed since the dinner party that shook the city's fashion elite to its core. And yet, the ripples from that evening continued to echo through boardrooms, runways, and media headlines. The photographs from the event, while absent of the actual confrontation, captured expressions, postures, and moments of tension that now circulated with captions and commentary. The fashion world had not simply witnessed a drama, it had been cracked open by it. Emma Carlyle sat alone in her private studio loft in Soho, a steaming cup of black coffee untouched beside her sketchbook. The soft hum of rain pattered against the glass walls, casting muted streaks across the concrete floor. Her pencil rested in her hand, idle above a half-formed sketch, an angular code inspired by the architecture of silence and storms. But the page remained unfinished. She had not heard from Claire since that night on the terrace. They hadn't texted, hadn't emailed. Emma had thought of reaching out more than once. She had even typed out messages, only to delete them before pressing send. Despite the emotional détente they'd reached on the rooftop, neither of them seemed ready to step fully into reconciliation. Maybe they were both afraid that the fragile peace would shatter under the weight of reality. Maybe silence for now was safer. Yet Emma could not stop thinking about that final sentence Claire had whispered beside her on the bench. Maybe is the first stitch. The words haunted her not like a wound, but like a possibility. Her studio had always been a sanctuary, but since the dinner, it felt like a mausoleum of old dreams. Rolls of fabric lined the shelves. Samples hung on mannequins like frozen memories, and framed magazine covers from her Carlisle and Rousseau days stared down from the walls with ghost-like reverence. Emma had moved on professionally. Her solo Brandem.ca was thriving, but her soul remained restless elsewhere across the city. Claire Rousseau sat in the back corner of a minimalist CF in Tribeca, hidden behind oversized sunglasses and a black cashmere turtleneck. Her assistant had delivered 3 portfolios that morning, emerging designers pitching collaborations, but she hadn't opened any of them. Her phone buzzed constantly, filled with PR damage control emails, investor concerns, and interview requests. But none of them mattered. Not like they used to. Her eyes drifted out the window, watching strangers hustle past. She wondered if they had read the Vanity Fair editorial, if they too had dissected her expression in the viral photos from Miles's dinner. The article hadn't been kind. 2 queens at war. The implosion of a fashion empire. The headline read, in truth, Claire didn't mind the backlash. She had long since grown numb to public criticism. What haunted her now wasn't public opinion, it was the raw sincerity of Emma's voice that night. For the first time in years, Claire had seen the friend she once loved, the same Emma who had pulled her out of panic attacks during their first New York showcase, who had snuck her sandwiches during their unpaid intern days, who had believed in her when no one else did. She had destroyed that Emma with one signature and a private meeting, and no amount of business acumen could undo it. Later that afternoon, as the rain slowed to a drizzle, Emma stood before the wall of fabric samples in her studio. Her eyes scanned the colors whites, charcoals, pastels, and she stopped at a bold streak of violet silk. It was the exact shade they had used in the final collection of Carlyle and Rousseau, a shade Claire had chosen. She reached for it instinctively, fingers grazing its surface, and without quite knowing why, she pulled it down and laid it across her work table. For the first time in days, her hands began to move to the same moment. Claire unlocked her apartment door and stepped inside, only to find an envelope waiting on the floor, slipped onto the crack. There was no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakably Emma's sharp, elegant, deliberate. Inside the envelope was a folded piece of sketch paper. On it was a drawing of a long coat, bold, structured, asymmetrical. It was powerful, feminine without being soft, beautiful without apology, and across the top, in Emma's handwriting, were just 2 words. For us. Claire stared at the sketch for a long time. The design spoke louder than any message Emma could have written. She felt her breath catch, not from guilt, but from hope. Maybe, just maybe, the door wasn't closed forever. 3 days later, Claire showed up at Emma's studio unannounced. Emma had just finished draping the violet coat on a mannequin when she heard the knock. Her heart caught in her throat when she opened the door and saw Claire standing there, umbrella in one hand, the sketch in the other. I couldn't stay silent, Claire said. Not after that. Emma stepped aside wordlessly and let her in. They didn't speak at first. Instead, Claire walked slowly around the studio, absorbing the changes. The space was sleek, stark, modern. It was all Emma, but pieces of their past still lingered. A mannequin stood in the corner dressed in an old C&R bodice. Their Paris award plaque hung modestly behind a stack of boxes. Claire stopped in front of the violet coat. You used the fabric. Emma nodded. It felt right. Claire turned to her. Is this a peace offering? It's a beginning, Emma replied. Or an ending? I'm not sure yet. Claire took a deep breath. I don't want an ending. I don't want silence between us. And I definitely don't want our story to end on a dinner table argument. Emma raised an eyebrow. So what do you want? I want to try again, Claire said. Not with a brand, not with investors or PR strategies. I just want to rebuild us quietly. Honestly, Emma studied her face. You sure about that? No cameras, no campaigns, just you and me. Yes, Claire said. I've had everything else and none of it meant anything without this. Emma looked down, then back up. Then let's start with one design. Claire smiled softly. One design. Over the next few weeks, they met quietly, early mornings in CAFS, late nights in Emma's loft, Sunday afternoons walking through Central Park. There were no contracts, no deadlines, just sketches and coffee and conversation. They revisited memories, laughed at old disasters, and occasionally cried when wounds reopened. Their relationship didn't heal overnight. Trust wasn't restored by a single apology or even 100 sketches. But something new began to take shape between them, a partnership reborn not from ambition, but from understanding. One afternoon in October, Claire arrived at Emma's studio with a folded garment bag. What's this? Emma asked. Claire opened it to reveal a blazer, sleek, sharp, dyed in the same violet tone as the coat, but the lining was embroidered with their old brand logo, C&R, interwoven into a heart. Emma's throat tightened. You kept it. I redesigned it, Claire said, to remind us where we came from, but also to let it go. They decided to release the pieces as part of a silent charity auction. No press, no branding, just 2 garments designed from the soul, sold anonymously, with proceeds going to young designers from underserved communities. The fashion world buzzed with speculation. Rumors swirled about the origin of the mysterious violet collection that appeared for one night only at a hidden auction gallery in Brooklyn. But neither Emma nor Claire confirmed their involvement. For once, the work spoke for itself. Months later, Emma sat on a panel at a design university, speaking to a group of students about artistic integrity. Someone in the audience asked about forgiveness in business. Emma paused, then smiled. It's rare, she said. But when it comes, it's like the first rain after a long drought. You can't force it. You can't fake it. But when it's real, you'll feel it in every thread you weave from then on. Meanwhile, Claire stood backstage at a non-profit event, watching young designers showcase their first pieces. One of them, a nervous, hopeful girl, wore a blazer that bore a familiar shade of violet. Claire didn't need to introduce herself. The work had already found its voice. Their story would never be a fairy tale. There was no happily ever after, but in the ashes of ambition and betrayal, something unexpected had bloomed: understanding, humility, and maybe even friendship. That night, Emma received a message on her phone. Claire, what are you doing tomorrow morning? She typed her response and smiled. Emma, sketching. Want to join? Claire, always. And somewhere in the heart of the city that had once watched them fall apart. Two women began again this time, one honest stitch at a time.